Thank you. I would be very much interested in tying this talk, especially for veterans, but for everyone, into the issue of war. So I will talk about what happens in American elections and what happened in the 2016 primary. And the latest material on this, election justice, has come out with a long and interesting and quite plausible statistical study of the pattern in decrease of votes for Sanders, increase for votes for Hillary, depending on precinct size, of all things. But I'll get to that a little bit at the end. So the first question that any of us might ask ourselves is, does my vote count? Do our votes count? Another way of putting this is voting a public matter? I was just discussing with George the current situation in which Barack, who had pictures of Gandhi and King up in his office, is a senator along with Lincoln and got the Nobel Peace Prize, even, I suddenly remembered last night. That was a long time ago. Is currently waging wars either with boots on the ground or by drone in 8 countries. The latest of them this week in Sirte in Libya. And that's a change, actually, for Barack. I think he's trying to nudge in the Clinton era, even though the Clinton era is very against the only decent things Barack has done, I am afraid, in foreign policy. Anyway, so the question is, here's the military. Oh, but it's privatized. As George was saying, there may be some 30,000 troops still in Afghanistan. How many years is it now? I think they owe 16, 15. And they even, forgetting the genocide against indigenous people from coast to coast, which marks America, say that this is the longest American war. Robert Kagan, the neocon, has written the book Dangerous Nation, which actually acknowledges the slaughter of indigenous people and actually says rightly that it was massacre often as a feed into America's expansionary, necessary, and this is a word Obama's come to recently, indispensable role in the world. Anyway, we've got 30,000 troops and 40,000 mercenaries, right? It's one reason the military budget is higher now than it was during the Cold War. Hard to believe, right? We spent a lot more, about 3 times as much. Height of the Cold War under Bill Clinton, or just at the end, it was about $250 billion. And Barack's first year is $704 billion. And this year, it's supposed to be around $600 billion, although that doesn't count intelligence, so-called. It does not count money spent in the Energy Department on nuclear research. And I think I saw an estimate from Andrew Bacevich that it was $1.7 trillion every year, but I couldn't deliver, if you ask me exactly how to explain that, although most of it's secret anyway. So, hey, the military is privatized. I thought that was public. These guys get to say, you know, I don't know whether I want to go into that battle, right? Pay me extra 10 cents an hour, maybe I'll go in. Or 10,000, maybe I'll go in, right? We got private prisons. We got judges who have deals sending kids to private prisons, railroading kids to private prisons, right now in the US of A. So you would think, I would think, I'm just a democratic theorist, that the vote is an equal basic right. I was in the civil rights movement. My friend Andy Goodman, who I went to kindergarten with, first to 4th grade, I almost went to Philadelphia, Mississippi. He did go. He was murdered there. So I'm afraid I take the right to vote pretty seriously. And when I hear about whole parties which don't like the right to vote, like the Republicans, I would say the name is false. They're the imperial authoritarian racists for the most part. And they betray the policy of Lincoln with every breath they draw, with every step they take. Unfortunately, the Democrats are this much better, as we've all seen in this election. I mean, it's better, but it's not much. Bernie may have succeeded in making it somewhat better domestically. But I'll come back to that. The first point is that voting is the greatest public matter. Now, there is something called exit polling. It was invented in 1967 by a fellow named Warren Matofsky. And Matofsky did about 3,000 of them in his life. And he was the head tester for Edison Matofsky Polling Company. And today that head is his successor, trained by him, Joseph Lenski. And with Matofsky, he did about 3,000 exit polls. And now, under Mr. Lenski, they have expanded Afghanistan, 2014, this one and that one. They've done about 30,000 in 128 countries. So exit polling seems like a big business. But it is a business. There's only one such company does American exit polls. It is commissioned by the National Election Pool, the big networks. ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, Fox, AP. So it turns out that how we predict elections is privatized. It turns out that those who demand the results, they're private too. So if there's some problem between the exit polls, some discrepancy between the exit polls and the final results, I protested about this in 2004 along with some of you. The strange results in Ohio and several other places and in the national election. You can't get the data because it's in private hands. Now then, the Democrats, who are a miserable corporate party, and personally I think Obama is likely to be, unless we have an insurrection for Bernie in 4 years or somebody else turns out to be pretty damn good, because there are some people, but I think we may remember Obama fondly, unfortunately in some ways. 40 years after Martin Luther King was killed, the first black president was elected, mixed race president. But Obama, although a community organizer and unusually smart, I always learned something listening to Barack's speeches. And I will say, if you haven't listened to the eulogy at the AMA church, you should listen to it. And even the one in Dallas, which I put up a post disagreeing with part of, is a very good thing in many ways. But Obama has furthered corporate and bank power, for example, in the housing crisis at the enormous expense of black folks, Chicanos, and poor whites. Anyway, the Democrats allowed states like this one to buy voting machines. Now, what's the problem with voting machines? Well, in 2004, they were touchscreen machines, and they had what was called proprietary programs. There's a lawsuit about it, and they don't have to tell anybody what's in the program. So maybe I missed something. I'm not sure how you ever know that what goes on with these silly machines, including the optical scan machines that people fought for, some people in this room in 2008, here in Colorado and California, whether they're any good either. The optical scan machine is better than the original Diebold machine because it leaves a paper trail. You may have heard of Volkswagen this year. They had a wonderful program for VWs, and I drove one, thinking that maybe it was better for a while. I now have a Nissan Leaf, so I get to sit around and charge, but it's just, feels good. It could beat the EPA's testing program and then pollute 40 times as much on the road. So there's a person in California who wrote a very good woman who wrote a very clever post saying, how do we know that we don't have Volkswagen-style elections here? Right? If that's what Volkswagen did, should we think that in the contest for power, the absolutely cutthroat contest for power, you want to know that Hillary's tough? The way she took the primaries has a toughness to it. Yeah, you don't have to worry about Hillary. Hillary is not the girl who gave the commencement speech at Wellesley against the war in Vietnam and about how we in the counterculture were creating a new era. That is long gone with Hillary, as well as, unfortunately, some of her older supporters, I am afraid. No, in order to be elected president, she has cultivated toughness, and we just saw the Democratic National Convention, which had a General John Allen speak about war, and USA. And the media did not cover, the corporate media. Lots and lots of Bernie delegates chanting, no more war, no more war. Oh, but we have freedom of speech and deliberation at the Democratic Convention, and Bernie's folks and Robbie Mook had such a good conversation day by day, and it's the truth. They did adapt a lot of Bernie's program that she had not wanted to adapt. But she didn't come through on the TPP. He said she'd come through on the TPP, but she and Tim Kaine are just jumping to get the TPP out there, except I will say on domestic issues, my own view is that Hillary has to do something to live up to her promises. That is, you can steal a lot of votes, but if she didn't have significant support among older black people or middle-class black people or not part of the Black Lives Matter movement, black people, I'm for the Black Lives Matter movement, thank you, wouldn't be doing so good. So I doubt that on that issue and on the issue of immigration, she's going to completely sell people down the river. And of course, Barack has sold people down the river on immigration. He has been the worst enforcer of ICE. He has split up families. He has done horrors. So now, I should just say as a point, the American president is the president of a very large empire. We have 1,180 military bases abroad. France has 5 in former French colonial Africa. Russia has 5, 4 of them in the former Soviet Union, 1 in Syria. Right? The UN has troops under its leadership. But if you want to know what everybody else thinks about the United States, it's good to talk to soldiers because they get to live out there, right? And we spend a lot of time making war in many places. So the first thing to note, and it's very important, is both of the corrupt corporate parties, the Republican Party unspeakable, and the Democratic Party sometimes in favor of the rule of law, the right to vote, and decency, although not entirely. I had thought that Obama would really be against torture, but the torturers have skated, and Chelsea Manning has been sentenced to 35 years in jail and now more for suicide attempt, right? And by the way, campaign about that. And I will just say, I don't know how Barack looks at himself in the mirror because he ain't Bill Clinton. I don't think. But you're the president of the empire, there's a price. It's a very heavy price. If Bernie had been elected or Jill Stein was elected, frankly, there would be a price unless there was a revolutionary movement for real, which would do nonviolent civil disobedience in a mass way and hold their feet to the fire because they are not going to give it over to a president. They might give it over to a big movement. And I will say on Bernie's behalf that the movement that came to pass around Bernie is an enormously significant thing and has reshaped American politics in very important ways. And the fact that he had an average contribution of $27 and raised more money than Hillary, being the sycophant of Wall Street. She is Wall Street, right? I mean, they are Wall Street. Chelsea's husband is a hedge fund manager, right, with Goldman Sachs, Bisvinsky, right? So they're Wall Street. You know, she's not a tool of Wall Street. That's a ridiculous way of putting it. She's just Wall Street. And they all know she's Wall Street. So Bernie really represented something different and created a different possibility. And if we survive the next period, which I'm afraid is very much in doubt, under either candidate, frankly, it's going to be a real problem. That is to say, Trump is a grotesque, racist madman who, I will just say, I have listened to him, and he makes my skin crawl. And he's the pure stuff, and it's KKK, recycled Britain first when they murdered Joe Cox. He was talking about the dangers to the police of Muslims in central London, right? Quoting from Britain First. And it is no accident that he bedecks Hillary Clinton with anti-Semitic symbols and has a rather pure connection to the National Alliance, whose founder, William Pierce, author of the Turner Diaries, actually praised Adolf Hitler as the greatest leader of the 20th century. So I will say that those who think that it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other are making a mistake. And I will now say, because I'm writing stuff steadily about this, that I haven't the slightest sympathy with Democrats who, having stolen the election from Bernie and having been completely dishonest, then say, oh, you have to get into line. Particularly since the policy of the Democrats, they are now the pro-war party every single day. So to go back to this question about the vote, our vote has been sold to private corporations that will not reveal the programs. Further, Diebold machines are easily cracked. They didn't have good programs 12 years ago when they were first selling them. And the Republicans passed the Help America Vote Act under Bush with the help of the Democrats. And it doesn't help America vote at all, because what it does is it produces these phony machines. And again, the optical scan machines are just as bad. They're Volkswagen-style elections. So if you were to ask, is there any way to know that American elections are fair? Not just that they don't appear to be fair, because they don't, to any sane person looking in from the outside, right? The election was swiped from Kerry, frankly. The Conyers Committee wrote a 107-page report on it. You can read it, particularly pages 72 to 77. It's excellent on all of the fraud pointing in one direction, particularly in Ohio, and it is exceptionally good on the exit polling. And the only way you can know if an American election is fair is exit polling. Initial exit polling, the kind that the US government does all over the world. The State Department used exit polling in what have been called, those who sneer at those who worry about exit polls, as conspiracy theorists in the corporate press. It has used this in what are called transitional democracies. So since the year 2000, there have been, according to a State Department AID group, Democracy International, 14 such elections, and the US has ruled 5 of them fraudulent because they are outside the margins of the exit polls. by quite a bit. Now, Democracy International has the following interesting observation. We would say that this was the best tool for evaluating elections, the fairness of elections. But we can't quite, because you know the results in the United States in 2004 were dubious. The exit polls got it wrong in 2004, so we can't. Well, that is a really interesting question, because under Mr. Matovsky, the Edison company, Edison-Matovsky, did exit polling in 154 elections in 2004. And what exit polling does is you ask a random sample of people who have voted, who did you vote for, 1 in 10, say. And they mostly tell you, they get about a 50% response rate. So sometimes, given what you know about the area and previous voting and various other things, I mean, population composition and just observation, if old people were really afraid to fill out questionnaires compared to young, enthusiastic Bernie voters, you would weight the votes so that you would account for old people voting, not just young people voting. So it turns out that in every election except the Kerry Bush election, 153 out of 154, exit polling got it right. It establishes, as all statistics do, a margin of error. That's a question about what the appropriate margin of error for exit polling is. And if you get results which are beyond the margin of error, or if you get the results massively beyond the margin of error, say, as in approximately 13 of 22 of the recent Democratic primaries, a very huge number, right? Same exit pollers got it right, except when South Carolina, they had Republican and Democratic exit polling on different days for the primaries, but in every other case, they got it right for the order of Trump, Cruz, Rubio, et cetera, and they got the margin right, mostly to within a point, often to within 0.3 of a point, in 20 of 22 cases. Same with people. Anyway, exit polling tells you when an election is fair. In Germany, after a court decision in 2009, every election is carried out in the following way. There are paper ballots. They are counted. And they take an initial exit poll, and they announce the results of the initial exit poll. And unless it's too close to call, right, if it's within the margin of error, it's too close to call, probably. If a 1/10 of a point is separating them in the exit poll, it's too close to call, right? But most elections ain't too close to call, and they get the result. Nobody has a problem, and unless you mess with the paper ballots, there are all kinds of errors made with paper ballots, but fact is, you can count the ballots afterwards. Now, in the UK, there's something like that. But here, in the good old US of A, which was ranked by a Harvard Australia study of democracies 60th, below Rwanda and the Ukraine. Right? Always, when they were chanting at the Democratic Convention for Hillary, the Mickey Mouse Club, USA, you! So, how about being patriotic in the sense of making sure that it's fair, the elections, right? And that we're not 60th in the world. And that we're not pushing everybody around with our grand military. What did that general say? We got the best equipment. And he had a lot of retired generals and admirals up there and a few troops. And they were all for Hillary. And if you were not a Marine general and I didn't know something about the Marines, I have a guy who's an Army officer who has been through, in my class this summer, who has been on many tours of duty and is going to go to Somalia to work with the State Department on selling weapons. He's figuring out what weapons to sell, but he's actually going to try to do some helpful civilian stuff and provide a model. But he's very unusual, as he says. So anyway, he was in Iraq, and he had cultivated in his little area having a relationship between his soldiers and the Iraqis and letting them know that we're Army guys, we're not Marines. No, I mean, because people see the Marines and they run, and they want to shoot them, right? So the Marine comes in, the head of the Marines, who's taken over for him. He's come back here to study. And he explains what's going on and what they're doing to reach out to civilians. And the guy looks at him, he says, "That's very nice, but I came here to kill Iraqis." Right? You get medals for killing. You don't get medals necessarily, I mean, for being shot and wounded and so on, as we saw in the course in the parents of Humayun Khan, who frankly should have won the election for Hillary, because Trump's performance about that really should, I mean, if you didn't already realize that the guy was a noisome Ku Klux Klan racist, right, that should do it. Now, I would just say, by the way, that the Clintons have a lot of confidence in, or whoever knows about this on the Clinton side, right, I'll say for the sake of argument that much of the fraud in the election was carried out by Hillary's minions, and we got to read some of Wasserman Schultz's emails and so on, right? Now, she did work for Hillary, and she's been taken on by Hillary again, but never mind, she ain't Hillary. So, you know, I mean, the Clintons probably can signal about this stuff, and they are surrounded by a coterie of people who tell them that really Hillary got a lot of votes against Bernie. Even that Hillary won against Bernie, which I personally find doubtful. I think actually that Bernie probably won quite strikingly, and the election justice account says that there were 134 votes, and they break them down state by state, that Bernie should have gotten and that were switched to Hillary. So that's a difference of 268, so nobody could have called the election. CNN did in collaboration with the Clinton campaign the night before the California election. Nobody could have fairly done that. So I will say that if Trump steals the election, but fortunately he makes so many enemies that he's going to have to figure out how to do this himself. You know, because the whole Republican national security apparatus is, well, I won't say something too sarcastic. I will just say, knows that Hillary will escalate the war in Syria and the Ukraine with Russia, and that is her main intent. And that is the intent of her future Secretary of Defense, Flournoy, and her future Secretary of State, or high up in the State Department, Victoria Nuland, who is married to Bob Kagan and was the chief bad actor of the Americans in the Ukraine, which, if you like, I'll talk to you about in the question period, since the report is that Putin, who is a monster, but not a stupid monster, that Putin ate the Ukraine, right? He ate the Crimea. And he did. What was NATO doing pushing up against the Ukraine? When the Soviet Union pushed up against Cuba and actually put nuclear-tipped missiles in there in 1962, did John F. Kennedy, whom we all like a lot more, I personally like John F. Kennedy a lot more than Putin, he saved us from nuclear war because they had the nuclear-tipped missiles in there, and if he'd listened to the wrong advice, we'd be smoke. I mean, the Earth would be smoke. There would be human extinction. 100 nuclear-tipped missiles, 90 miles from the East Coast. I was at Harvard at the time. So I didn't like Kennedy that much, but I have now read this stuff, and I'll tell you, I don't know there's another modern leader who would have avoided nuclear war in that situation. So I have a pretty high impression of Jack Kennedy right now. Anyway, the point about it is that you do not have to have too much wit to figure out that Russia begged to be admitted to NATO when it became capitalist in 1990. And guess who didn't take them. HW, along with Belgium. Belgium spoke up very firmly. We don't want these Russians. We might have to take all of Eastern Europe. So they've taken all of Eastern Europe. This is aggression, folks. This is making war on Russia. This is cornering Russia. This is putting military bases on Russia's shore. If you think that they were going to take that line down, well, you read the corporate American press, just like you think that, if you think Hillary Clinton won by, she only won 55 to 45. I mean, Bernie had a lot of delegates anyway, right? But if you think Hillary Clinton won, I mean, maybe she squeaked through, but nobody is going to count this up too easily. And the Edison company keeps it private property. So here's the first and central point. With all these monopolies keeping privatized codes and machine voting, there is no way to know that an American election is fair except the initial exit poll. There is no way of checking them. And by the way, in Chicago and many other places, in Illinois, Bernie is shown as winning on the exit poll 57 to 48, and Hillary squeaks out a 1.5 win. That probably is within an enlarged margin of error of the sort that Edison uses, though they won't make it clear what they use, right? But obviously, had the votes been fairly counted, Hillary would have had a devastating defeat in one of her home states, right? I think that actually is her home state, unless I'm mistaken. And, that would have had a big effect on the election, right? Exit polling is the only way that we can know that an American election even appears to be fair, because everything else is privatized and leaves no paper trail. And in Chicago, election observers saw them changing votes for Hillary, Sanders votes into Hillary votes, or disqualifying Sanders votes, and testified about it to a group reviewing this before the Secretary of State signed it, and they wouldn't listen to him. They testified eloquently. You can get the tapes up on YouTube. And they wouldn't listen to him. And they just, we're just checking the bare mechanics. We don't care.
Excuse me. May we ask questions as you're speaking? Or do I wish to do
We have a policy where we allow the speaker to continue his presentation, and then he'll take questions at the end. That way they can get through.
That would be good, because also I have to repeat your questions since this is being taped, so that other people can hear them. And so look, the second big point is this. Although initial exit polling is fair and guarantees the fairness of the election, the Edison company, with its sole spokesman, Joe Lenski, does not report initial exit polling, or if it does, the media corporations don't want to report this, generally speaking, because of the bad result in the Bush-Kerry election. And what they do instead is they say, this is the line of foolishness that Joshua Holland of The Nation and Nate Cohn, these guys get angry if you raise any questions and say you're a conspiracy theorist, because why should anybody want to know whether American elections are fair, and why should reporters for a paper which is 2,000% pro-Clinton, and I stopped subscribing to the Times. I had many provocations before, so I'll just say, this one was too much. Right. They all get mad, but their line of argument, they do not want to discuss this honestly. Exit polling, at least if it's done as it's done when the U.S. pays for it abroad, is a pretty good check on the fairness of elections. But here, Mr. Lenski has invented something else since 2004. We, he says, for the national election pool, the media corporations are interested in just one thing, And that is what people are interested in. We want to know the demography of how people vote. We want to know how young people vote, old people vote, black people vote, white people vote, people with incomes over $60,000 a year vote, et cetera, et cetera. We're not interested in who wins and who loses. Now, Holland is so credulous that he just reports this straight up. This was the first time that the great Lenski had spoken publicly. He doesn't write, but you know, it was a real crisis in New York. But when he then spoke to Philip Bump, the fixer at the Washington Post, it's an appropriate name, he says, I don't have a dog in this race, but actually, he says, what the aim of exit polling is to shape the exit poll to the final result. In other words, you get the precinct results rolling in and all the stuff rolling in, and Lenski changes the exit poll, or the Edison people change the exit poll, until it gets closer and closer to the final result. And this election justice report, which is very good, neither emphasizes the point that democracy, it says democracy lost, but it means about what happened on the machines. It doesn't say straight up the privatization, monopolization, and so on of exit polling and machines means that anything can be fixed and nothing is fair. Holland says, or Lenski says in the interview with Holland, well, actually Holland gives this. Okay, so we have a complicated exit poll here. If you want to find out who won and lost, you just ask them who won or who lost. That's what they do in transitional democracies unlike us. We're 60th in the world. He didn't mention that. But that's what they do in transitional democracies. And they have many, many more people at polling places. Not 1 in 10, but perhaps 1 in 5 or 1 in 2. And every polling place. So, you know, if you ask everybody, you're going to get the, you know, basically going to get the result. So that's why they get the result. And we're not interested. The media, national media pool doesn't ask us. We just do a demography of characteristics. So about this, wouldn't it be more free market, and in any case more consistent with democracy as a public good, if the U.S. government funded an exit poll itself at every, you know, at least as many as many as are necessary to get a fair result. My guess is 1 in 10 is fine for reasons that I'll explain fully in a minute. It would seem that if they didn't ask all these demographic questions and they just asked who'd you vote for, that we would find out the most interesting thing, and then they could release that and keep paper ballots, and we would have a fair estimate of the elections, and it would be harder for anybody to monkey with the exit polls. Oh, unfortunately, election justice doesn't think of that one, which they should. But it is an absolutely odd thought that Edison isn't trying to get it right. And none of the people who ask questions, including Doug Johnson Hadlam, who has done the best work on this of anybody and is really worth reading. He's one of the main authors of this election justice report. But he's so thrilled after weeks and weeks of trying to get through to Lenski, who will not give him an interview but allows him to write 10 questions to him, that he cites him gratefully as an expert and doesn't notice that he is the executive vice president of a big monopoly which controls exit polling in the United States. So if you want to know why Mitofsky ran away from the question, why did the exit polls show that Kerry won by 3 points nationally, and how come only a day later did the Edison-Mitofsky company adjust them so that Bush won by 2 points? And how come the exit polls showed that Kerry won by 4.4 in Ohio, but the final results was a 2.3 victory for Bush? And he says it's our fault. We must have made a mistake. There must be within precinct errors. And they wouldn't release their raw data. And to my knowledge, they never have. They were requested by the Conyers Committee and did not. Lenski says it's all at the Roper Center, but you have to have better clearance than to get to be Hillary Clinton's advisor to get there, is my guess. And so far, nobody has seen exit polling data from there. But when they revealed data, some data, in January of 2005, it turned out that all of the votes for Bush turned up in places that were already 80% or better for Bush. Their theory had been that evangelicals who were voting for that godly man were afraid to fess up to the exit pollers that they were voting for that godly man. They weren't proud of it. They weren't moved by the Spirit to speak to that poor person standing there trying to ask him a question. So I'm sorry, in places where 80% are better for Bush, the chances of that being true are zero. Right? And it also turned out that what Matovsky said was false in other ways. But the result of it is he took the blame for the error, because American elections are never wrong, even though you can't ever get a paper trail to check them. The whole corporate media, every one of these, I'm nonviolent, but I'm going to say this, clowns, I'm being unfair to clowns, says it's ridiculous to think that ever in an American election is the election stolen. Right? They're always fair. The result that's reported to you in the evening is always fair. Once the thing closes, it's always fair. Now, I'm sorry, with privatized voting machines, plus the Edison Company and so on, there's exactly no reason, unless you live in a rural county, which counts ballots, to believe that the election is fair, anywhere. Right? And that's why that line of argument is so important to pursue sharply. The people at Election Justice know it, but they don't pursue this. Which, since I sent Hadlam my piece on it, he may not have gotten it because it was one of his, I got his address over the internet and I didn't pursue it. But I think that's an error in the thing. It makes it a stronger argument if you notice that aside from initial exit polling, which is completed when the last vote is counted and is not doctored with precinct results, you get the result right in most elections. Now, Lenski, who never talks much, did jump right in with Philip Bump and say the opposite of what he had said in the interview the day before to Josh Holland. Bump at the Washington Post again. What he says to Bump is, this is the thing I told you before, in 20 out of 22 cases, well, he just gives one case, but it is not 20 out of 22 cases, we got it right for Trump within a point. And he says we got it right when all the polls were showing that Hillary was going to have a big victory in Michigan. We had Bernie winning by 2 points all day. Now, actually, apparently they had Bernie winning by a little more. But he did win by 2 points. And that was a huge victory. And if you consider this argument about the young person voting and how the young people in New York City just jumped in the faces of those poor exit pollers, they couldn't notice any older people. So actually, in this one exceptional time, because, it's the biggest election, Wolf Blitzer came out and he said, the exit poll shows Clinton 52%, Sanders 48.7. Had that remained the result, probably Sanders would have won. That would have been a huge slew of delegates, right? The final result was 57.95 to 42.05. 15.9% difference. Much bigger than double carries, right? The Kerry Bush difference, at least. Huge difference, right? And it was, you know, about 11 points beyond the margin of error, and depending on how it's calculated anyway, it's a very, very big differential. There were bigger ones in states that Hillary won, plainly like Alabama, but I'll come back to that in a minute. That is, she did win them, but she was shown as winning them on the exit polls by 10%, and she won them by 30% or 40%. Again, a lot of delegates come from that, right? That's why I say, if you begin to add up all of these votes, if Hillary didn't have those 2.5 million votes more than Bernie, and she didn't anyway, because, by the way, no caucus state was counted, so no vote was counted from Colorado. Although, unless I'm mistaken, Bernie won here 2-1, right? So, again, this is sort of dishonest press coverage. But Blitzer kept announcing this, and they even announced it on MSNBC, the world's most corrupt station, completely on the take for Clinton, including Rachel Maddow, whom I used to like, and I don't. No, I pay somebody $7 million a year, and they will, you know. The woman from Tulane, a very good woman who was doing a social justice, Harris Perry. Yeah, right. She had the walk because she's black, and also she wanted to do social justice. And Rachel Maddow and the rest of these clowns didn't have the guts to stand up for her. Go back and listen to his commentary on the election. I don't know if he's bored or not. I know that he wants to stay employed at MSNBC, and so he lied through his teeth about Bernie. And, you know, he's a better guy than probably some of them. But, you know, as far as it goes, I've gotten in trouble many times on my faculty for standing up for non-white people against the authorities. Been ostracized by my dean for 2 years and various other things. So, you know. Probably I feel better about myself. And probably, you know, you never know what you're going to do when the time comes, but I will just say, if you're anti-racist and you allow them to harm anyone when you know about this, you better turn in your card, so to speak, because somebody who thinks you're racist probably be right, or somebody thinks you're self-seeking probably be right. So there was this huge differential. And you may remember the Brooklyn Secretary of the Election Board, Diane Haslett-Rodiano, who threw out 123,000 votes, most of them Bernie votes. And there were standard errors in the election, and again, all of this election justice records like, and they started doing this in Nevada and Arizona. If you're young and you voted in the last couple of elections as a Democrat, or you changed your registration to Democrat in plenty of time, you might find out that you were Republican. Or you might find out, if you voted for the first time in 2008, that you registered as an independent in 2004. Hundreds of cases. Right? And long descriptions. And all over New York, you know, on Long Island, a woman, Francesca Rhiannon, who was canvassing people before for Bernie, and she went to be an election judge, and 25% of the people who came in to vote, their registration had been screwed with. No one had ever seen anything like it before. So there are a number of just sheer acts of fraudulence. And by the way, go back to 2008. You know, in Harlem, folks, they are so pro-Hillary that in 2 precincts in Harlem, there were no votes for Barack Obama. 0. South Carolina has the worst election machines in the country, and it's really easy to steal elections. And even Nate Silver had a report where he considered that possibility in 2010. Not now, thank you. Nate is into the bullshit that really polls are what tells you what goes on, and not exit polls, preliminary polls. Why are exit polls better? Chances are, if you're asking a certain number of people randomly who they voted for, and you pick the right precincts and you set it up well enough, you get paid a lot of money, like the Edison Company does, because you get it right most of the time, right? Maybe even all the time. And they get it right abroad. The only place they don't get it right, all these primaries affecting Hillary Clinton. And in New York, they didn't get it right massively. South Carolina had the lowest percentage of people voting in their sleepy little primary of any state in the country. Now, you may remember that New York is the Big Apple. I think the New York Times is published in New York. I think The Nation is published in New York. I think all of these people who are screaming about conspiracy theorists and exit polls, they're all located in New York. I think a bunch of the studios are in New York. Some of them are in Los Angeles. But anyway, there's a lot of control comes out of New York. It was the election that was going to decide the fate of Hillary Rodham Clinton, whether she would make it to the nomination or not. In this election, 19.7% of the eligible population voted, the second lowest total to South Carolina. If you believe that, there is a bridge in Brooklyn you really might like to buy. You don't have to think that Clinton did this herself. The whole apparatus, Nita Lowey, who works with her, actually bought an apartment, apparently a building from Rodiano for $6 million a couple years ago. And its worth was about $1.5 million. Who knows? Bill de Blasio's out there campaigning for Clinton. Some of us used to think he was pro the Sandinistas and showed up in Nicaragua once upon a time, you know, as an interracial marriage, tells his son Dante, look out for the police. The New York police turned their back on him. That was commendable of him, right? But it turns out he's just a Democratic Party hack. And the whole Democratic Party machine worked overtime, as you can tell, reading the DNC emails, which they have going on about make war with Russia, make war with Russia. Russia's trying to influence the election. They're trying to put Trump in. And don't look at what these things say. One of the guys actually apologized. He put on his Facebook page an apology because that would be the decent thing to do. Wasserman Schultz actually showed up at the convention and had such a bad time in Florida that she left. But she has a cushy job with Hillary.
What is your new job?
Huh?
What was your new job?
Some main job with the campaign. She worked for Hillary's campaign in 2008 and became the head of the Democratic National Committee, and that's Obama's fault. And
chair of Hillary's campaign?
yeah, because Hillary is so against putting all her and all Bill's, Bill has been not eating his usual diet. He has been eating greens, so he's gotten thin. So, maybe Chelsea too. Maybe they do a little family act on top of the scale. Plus the rest of the Democratic National Committee. No, I mean, it's shocking that they could have pulled off this farce in New York, and that they get away with it because they're very powerful, and although lots of people came into this election, and young people in particular, young people were certifiably out there to vote for Bernie. And I was at a rally at DU, 5,000 people, April a year ago. Barack got 30,000 in February of 2008, not in February or April of 2007. It was clear something was going on, right? You listen to Bernie, it was pretty cool. It was pretty cool. So there is this thing that Bernie had to deliberate, but he had promised not to run separately if he lost. And although they knew this was going on and raised a row about a whole bunch of cheating in the campaign, they were disparaged and kept out of the mainstream press and so on. So he made a choice. It is not a choice that I'm particularly happy with. But on the other hand, I do think that a huge split vote between him and Clinton could easily have elected Trump. And it is at least possible. And I think that Bernie is correct about Trump. I would probably put it more strongly than Bernie. I mean, I think, and you can tell, I mean, to say I really dislike Hillary is an understatement, right? I think she is a nasty, dangerous warmonger, and we have to have a huge movement against her, right? And I also think that you should vote your conscience, because after the Democrats have screwed up all these voting machines and all the rest of it, I'm sorry. If my vote ain't going to count anyway, I'm damn well not going to betray myself so I can be responsible for a larger war with Russia, which has nuclear arms. But that this election was stolen, there's little doubt. Now here's the other thing that Hatlam and the other people did, and it's very smart. Hatlam used Alabama as a check on various theories, like the first theory that all these people came up with is young people voted overwhelmingly for Sanders. And Lenski doesn't deny this except to say we reweight voting constantly. And they've only done it, 130,000 times, right? We're reweighting this all the time. I think they got young people right in Michigan. Polls didn't get it right in Michigan. One other speculation in this report, I don't know if it's true. Since we can't see Lenski's data, he won't release it. We don't know how they adjusted the exit polling initially, but if they did any adjustment on the basis of the ordinary polls that were showing Clinton winning by 15 points in Michigan the week before, then Bernie won by more. Right? And there's no way of telling until you know how they adjusted these things. But even from the polls they did, and even though what he does is completely corrupt, that is reversing exit polling, initial exit polling as a test of fairness, and making up whatever the person who steals the election, whatever serves them. That's what they do now. That's what's called exit polling by the National Election Pool. And Josh Holland, Nate Cohn in the New York Times, who may be, he is incredibly nasty, but this may be the stupidest, most naive thing that any so-called smart person said. He said, look, if there was a flaw in the exit polling, Lenski, whom I interviewed, would call it. The National Election Pool would call it. A, they're private corporations. B, their money is made because American elections are fair, 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 fair. No, they suppress telling you the initial exit poll. You have to watch like a hawk, and you have to keep track of it, and they start changing it immediately, so you really have to work to get these figures. And you can get them on CNN and so on, but you have to work at it, right? They don't just give them to you. And the reason that they don't just give them to you is that they're a real good test of fraud. So you wouldn't want to have them. And instead, they give you these dummied up results. So in my article, and I think I sent it to George, but I would be happy to send it around to anybody who hasn't seen it. I wrote a longish article, and some version of it will probably come out in Who, What, Why pretty soon. I'm not completely clear on this, but they've been encouraging this, and their political editor is looking it over. But this is going to go on for a long time. The Election Justice Report, Democracy Lost, is as good as the Conyers Report, Preserving Democracy. In certain ways, it's much better. They actually were in touch with Lenski, and they're not like me pointing out, Lenski, he's getting millions of bucks from this, right? He's going to go out of business if he says, we screwed it up, there's something wrong, Hillary's stealing the election, right? Oh, Nate Cohn works for the New York Times. I guess he just doesn't understand big business at all. I don't know how the message is conveyed at the New York Times, but I do know this. There was not one fair, let alone pro, Bernie Sanders article in the New York Times the whole time, except on one issue they wrote an editorial saying Bernie had to write about something. Every column was against Bernie. So it would be an act of principled journalism, which I do not expect from people who work for the New York Times anymore, at all, any of them, for them to have actually spelled out some of this stuff. And it would be very useful. Oh, so here's the thing that Hadlam does, and the other people. They take Alabama. Alabama doesn't have a big young vote. It's one of the lowest percentage youth votes, about 15%. And they find that if you go from smallest precinct to biggest, there's a big change in the direction of Hillary. And it isn't because the biggest precincts are black. Some of them are, but some of them aren't. And they trace it out city by city. And they do this all over the country, and they work it out for 18 states. So this is pretty interesting. Their theory, or his theory, is the following. The way this was done is he talks about the election machines. These are 10-year-old or 12-year-old election machines, which are easy to bug, right? So you insert an algorithm, they're also connected, which changes the vote by 2 or 3 points in bigger places, right? And then it shifts the vote to Hillary. So exit poll says she wins by 10% in Alabama, but she really wins by 30% according to the machine results. She did this all over the South. If you take those votes away from her in the South, it is undoubtedly true that she won in the South. Bernie hadn't been really introduced yet. And there's a rumor among black folks, Michelle Alexander, whom I very much admire, says, you know, the Clintons, they were the best Republican presidents ever. Hillary cares so much for kids. You know what she did? She cut out welfare. 70% of the people there are black kids and white kids, poor white kids, and Chicano kids, right? And you want to know why we have so many people in prison? It's because of Mr. Bill and his sentencing. And Hillary has this horrific sentence about super predators, which, by the way, some Black Lives Matter kids asked her about. She didn't do very well. And Mr. Bill exploded and says, she believes that they have to get those perpetrators off the streets, even if you don't. It was not a good day for Mr. Bill. He lost it completely. He was not charming and in love with Hillary, as he was at the convention, I'm afraid. It was not his best day. Dealing with black people sort of pushing on him. Mr. Bill has a lot of racism. Hillary works with a lot of minority folks. They're her closest allies. 4 of the mothers spoke for her. She's changed in various ways. She went to Flint. She gave a very good statement on it. Again, I believe that Hillary will do a lot better on this. And I think it's also a life and death question for her. So she can be a terrible sociopath, which most of them are. I mean, the Obamas aren't, but most of them are. And still has to do it, or she ain't going to get elected again. But about war, forget it. So anyway, if you combine what the Election Justice Group has done, which I think is very striking, I've written a bunch of things about this and debated about this, and I will pursue it. But I think there are a lot of different people working on this. I think after the election, if Hillary does get in, it will be possible to raise this. The Democrats will be trying to suppress it. But I think actually that enforcing paper ballots and or new machines and exit polls, which are really exit polls, and having demonstrations and making a huge fuss would be a very good thing. And also, I think we have to crack open this place about war. Because Trump is a monster racist Ku Klux Klan creep. But actually, although Guy Manafort, his assistant, worked for 10 years for Yanukovych, and he and Putin have this love affair. And all the claims that are made by Talking Points memo about how corrupt he is true. And probably Russia's the only people he can do business with. It is also true that the US and NATO are responsible for producing war with Russia, that they went right up to Russia, that Nuland is a neocon who is married to Robert Kagan, promoted rapidly through she was Cheney's person in the State Department, and then she became Hillary's person in the State Department while organizing, while supporting the Ukrainian resistance, which is partly a big democratic thing, the Maidan revolution, and partly a just straight Nazi thing. In Kiev, where the main demonstrations were, there was a statue to Stefan Bandera. Anybody know who Stefan Bandera is? He was the leader of the Ukrainian fascists who, in all of these places which were kind of stateless because there was war going on and so on, there were mass killings of Jews. Much more in the East, even than in Germany. So approximately 184,000 Jews out of the 187,000 in Kiev were murdered by Stefan Bandera. And Himmler and Goebbels had a debate about whether the Ukrainian Nazis were really part of the master race. And they're all part of the Right Front. And as I say, you can see that statue there now. So there is a real democratic movement in the Ukraine too. Yanukovych is very bad, but U.S. messing around has produced grave, Putin, he could have been any Russian leader. You'd have you didn't have to be a thug who murders people with polonium in London. He could be some nice person. Barack is the nicest guy in the world, but he murders civilians and children with drones in about 8 countries right now, and has since he's president. So I would be careful about how Putin is the nastiest guy in the world. And Hillary is a lot worse than Barack. So, like in Honduras. But, Barack officiated, but Hillary did it. In the Ukraine, Nuland curses out the EU in her phone conversation with the American ambassador, which is taped. You can get it on YouTube. And pushes for the U.S. being in there to support the Ukrainian movement because it will really sock it to Russia. Now the problem is if you do things like that, Russia, which has nuclear weapons and a better army than we do apparently, at least in Syria, at least they use them rapidly and get them out. They were quite efficient in Syria. If we did one intervention, which we got out in 4 months, I think that would be very impressive, wouldn't it? What intervention was that? I don't even think with the Spanish-American War, I think we still got Guantanamo, don't we? It seems like it goes on and on. Gee, that would be the longest one, that occupation, but maybe there hasn't been any war in it. They don't like that we have Guantanamo there since Batista fell. I don't know how you measure that one. Oh, there is that, yes. Anyway, this business of election stealing is the most dangerous because it's connected to war. And it's very sad that Hillary, to be elected, I'm a woman. If I'm not the toughest guy in the room, they're going to, nobody's going to vote for me. Right? If I can't drink John McCain under the table, nobody's going to vote for me. So she has made herself and her aides, the whole group of them, and spoken for by Bob Kagan as that which will reach out to grab the Ukraine. Thank you. We are the most powerful, dynamic nation in the world, says Mr. Kagan in his 2012 book on American Power, read by Barack Obama, who unfortunately has moved back from certain things since he read that book. And he's 2,000% for Hillary Clinton, and he writes a column once a month for the Washington Post, which is extremely good on how Trump is a fascist. So since he started out with the Straussians,